My name is Josephine Adler and I am 37 years old. 9 months ago, I had surgery for a ruptured appendix. It happened on a Saturday morning in March, which was the same Saturday morning as my younger sister Becca's baby shower. My parents knew I was being admitted to the hospital at 7 a.m. They knew the surgery was scheduled for 9. They attended the baby shower. They arrived at the hospital at 4 in the afternoon, 7 hours after my surgery concluded. 45 minutes before visiting hours ended, and they stayed for 22 minutes. I know it was 22 minutes because I watched the clock. I know the surgery lasted 2 hours and 11 minutes because I have my records. I know when they left because the nurse's aide who came in to take my vitals after they walked out looked at me in the specific way that hospital staff look at you when they have heard something they are not supposed to have heard and have decided not to comment on it. And I looked at the time on the monitor and I noted it. What I did not know until the following Tuesday, when I was home and recovering, was that my parents had sent a card while I was still in the hospital, which a neighbor had picked up from my mailbox and brought to my apartment, and which was addressed to Jacqueline Adler. My name is Josephine. It has never been Jacqueline. Before I tell you what I did with the card and what I said to my parents when I was well enough to say it, please take a moment to like and subscribe. Drop your city and your local time in the comments. I want to know where you are. Now let me take you back to the year I turned 12 and explain what kind of family produces a card addressed to someone who does not exist. My parents, whose names are Daniel and Rosemary Adler, are people I can describe most accurately by their relationship to certainty. They are certain people, not confident, which is a different thing, but certain, meaning they have organized their lives around a set of beliefs about how things should work and who people are and what matters, and they operate within those beliefs with the consistency of people who have never had significant cause to revise them. My father spent 31 years as a high school history teacher and retired 2 years ago, and he is, in professional contexts and in the historical record, deeply attentive to detail and to the significance of specific events. My mother worked part-time as a bookkeeper for 20 years and has the precise financial mind of someone who has spent decades ensuring that every number is where it belongs. Both of these things are true about my parents, and neither of them transferred to the way they attended to my life, which is a fact I have spent 37 years sitting with, and which I am now describing in terms that are as accurate as I can make them. Becca is 5 years younger than me and has been, for as long as I can remember, the more easily loved child, which I say not to diminish her but to name the structure accurately. She was the easier temperament, the more legible need, the child who wanted what my parents knew how to give, and who received it with the gratitude that made the giving feel sufficient. I was the more complicated input. I asked questions. I disagreed. I had a particular and specific set of interests that did not overlap cleanly with my parents' interests, and that required them to learn something new to engage with. And they have never been people who found that kind of learning easy or natural. I am not saying they did not love me. I am saying that loving me required more adjustment than loving Becca, and they have always, by small and consistent margins, chosen the path of least adjustment. The baby shower was not the beginning of this. It was the most recent and most vivid expression of a pattern that had been running since I was 12 years old, and I started becoming the version of myself that required the adjustment. What happened when I was 12 is something I have described in exactly 2 conversations in my adult life, and I am going to describe it here, because it is the root of the card, and of the 22 minutes, and of the name that was not mine. When I was 12, I won the Regional Science Fair, which was the largest thing I had accomplished in my life to that point, and which required me to be at the District Education Center on a Saturday morning in April. I had been working on my project for 3 months. My father had expressed interest in it in October and had not asked about it again between October and April. My mother had helped me buy materials in November. On the Saturday of the science fair, my sister had a dance recital. It was Becca's first recital. She had been in dance for 4 months. My parents attended the recital. They did not attend the science fair. My project won second place, and I received the ribbon from a judge I had never met, and I called home afterward. And my mother said, "Oh, we had the recital today, wasn't it wonderful?" and asked if I had heard how Becca did in the arabesque section. I said I had not heard. She said she had been remarkable. I said I had come in second. She said that was great, and then she asked what we were having for dinner. I was 12. I had no frame for what had happened except that something had. And I put the ribbon in my closet, and I did not tell anyone about it for 8 years. When I was 20, I told a college roommate. When I was 32, I told my therapist. This is the 3rd time. I am telling it now because the card addressed to Jacqueline is not about a wrong name. It is about the pattern that produced the wrong name. And to understand that pattern, you have to know about the ribbon in the closet and the arabesque section. I want to be specific about what the surgery was. I had been having intermittent abdominal pain for 2 days, which I had been managing with the specific denial of someone who has too much to do to be sick. And on the Friday evening, the pain became something else, and I called a nurse line. And the nurse asked 3 questions and said I needed to go to the emergency room immediately. I went. The emergency room physician looked at my blood work and ordered a CT scan, and the CT scan showed a perforated appendix, which is the stage past appendicitis, and which means the appendix has already ruptured and the infection has begun spreading into the abdominal cavity, and which is a medical situation with a specific and documented risk profile that requires immediate surgical intervention. I was admitted at 7 a.m. on Saturday. The surgical team was assembled for 9. I called my parents from the emergency room on Friday evening when it became clear I was being admitted. And my mother said she was so sorry, that was terrible, and that they had the baby shower in the morning. But they would come to the hospital as soon as it was over. She said it with genuine feeling, the feeling of someone who was sorry, and who had also already organized the day in a way she intended to maintain. I said I understood. I hung up the phone and I did not call them again that night or that morning because I had decided on the phone that I was not going to spend any of the energy I needed for the surgery on the conversation that the baby shower decision deserved, and that the conversation could wait until I was on the other side of the operating room. I want to stop here because there is something I need to ask you before this story continues. Have you ever been in a hospital bed or in any situation of serious need and understood in the moment that the people who were supposed to be there were not going to come? Not because they could not, but because they had decided something else was more important? Tell me in the comments what that moment felt like and what you did with it. I read every word. And please subscribe now if you have not already. Because what happened when my parents arrived 7 hours after my surgery, and what I said to them when I was well enough to speak, is the part I have been building toward, and it is not the conversation I expected to have. The surgery was performed by a surgeon named Dr. Kwan, who I had met for the first time at 8:45 in the morning when she came into the prep area to introduce herself and review the procedure. She was direct and specific, and she said what she was going to do and how long it would take and what the recovery would involve, and she answered the 3 questions I had written on the back of my insurance card because I had known I was going to be nervous and I had wanted to prepare the questions while I was still calm enough to think clearly. The surgery took 2 hours and 11 minutes. I came out of anesthesia at approximately 12:30. The recovery nurse who was there when I woke up was named Gail, and she had a quiet and unhurried manner that I found calming in the specific way that competence is calming when you have just been through something and you are still trying to understand where you are. She told me the surgery had gone well, that Dr. Kwan was pleased with how it had proceeded, and that I would be moved to a standard room within the hour. I asked if anyone was waiting. She said not yet, which was the accurate and kind answer to a question that could have had a more specific and unkind answer, and I received it for what it was, and I closed my eyes and I rested. My parents arrived at 4 in the afternoon. They came in together, which is how they navigate situations they are uncertain about, meaning they use the presence of the other as a buffer against having to be individually accountable. And they sat in the 2 chairs beside the bed, and my father said, "How are you feeling?" And my mother said, "You gave us quite a scare," which was the sentence I had predicted. Because giving someone a scare is the framing that centers the emotional experience of the person who was not in the hospital rather than the person who was, and it was consistent with the pattern, and I had been expecting it. I said I felt like someone who had had emergency abdominal surgery that morning. My father said the shower had been lovely. My mother said Becca had been radiant. I said I was glad it had been lovely. They sat for 22 minutes. My mother asked about the nurses. My father asked whether I had eaten anything. My mother said she would bring soup on Monday. They left at 4:47. The nurse's aide came in at 4:48 and looked at me and looked at the time and did not say anything. And I looked at the monitor and noted 4:48 and closed my eyes. I want to describe what the days between their visit and the card arriving felt like, because the texture of those days is part of the story. I was in the hospital through Sunday night. My friend Margot, who lives 2 miles from my apartment, and who I had texted from the emergency room on Friday night because she is the person I contact in situations that require actual assistance rather than emotional support, had arranged for someone to water my plants and had brought me a bag with things I had not had time to pack, including a book and a phone charger and the specific kind of crackers I always eat when I am sick, which she knew because she had seen me sick enough times to know. She came to the hospital on Saturday evening, and she sat with me for 3 hours, and she did not say anything significant or useful or wise. She sat there and read her book, and occasionally showed me something on her phone, and asked whether I was comfortable, and whether I needed anything from the nurse's station, and the ordinariness of her presence was the most useful thing anyone could have provided me. In that particular hospital room, on that particular Saturday, and I have thought about it many times since. On Sunday, a colleague from my department at the university where I am an assistant professor sent me a message saying she had arranged coverage for my Monday and Tuesday classes and to focus on recovery. On Monday, my doctoral advisor, who retired 6 years ago and who I still speak with regularly, sent me a message that said simply, "I heard you had surgery. I am thinking of you. And get well when you can." I received all of these things and I noted them and I stored them as evidence of something, which was that care was available in the world and that I had people in my life who provided it, and that the absence of my parents in the first hours after my surgery was an absence and not a statement about the available supply of care. The card arrived on Tuesday. Margot had arranged for my neighbor Bernard, who has a spare key, to check my mailbox, and he left the card on my kitchen counter with a note that said I saw this, and it looked like it might be from your family. Hope you are feeling better. I opened it sitting on my couch in the specific position my discharge instructions recommended, which was reclined at an angle that did not put pressure on the incision. The card had a photograph of flowers on the front. Inside, my mother had written, "Get well soon. We love you," in her handwriting, which I recognized. The envelope was addressed to Jacqueline Adler, apartment 4C, which is my apartment number. My name is Josephine. It has never been Jacqueline. There is no one named Jacqueline Adler at my address, and there has never been anyone named Jacqueline Adler at my address. My mother has known my name for 37 years. She wrote the wrong one on an envelope to the address she had looked up or had in her contacts, meaning she had the address correctly and the name incorrectly. And the incorrectness is the thing I want to examine rather than the correctness, because the incorrectness tells me something specific about the quality of attention that produced the card. Before I tell you about the conversation I had with my parents 3 weeks after the surgery, and what each of them said, and what I said, and was not resolved by the end of it, I want to stop here. If someone in your life has gotten the details of your life wrong, not once, but as a pattern, not through memory failure, but through the specific and consistent kind of insufficient attention that is different from forgetting, I want you to tell me about it in the comments. Tell me what they got wrong and whether they knew it was wrong. Subscribe now if you have not already, because the conversation I had when I was recovered enough to have it is the one I want to tell you about. And I have been thinking about what to say and how to say it for 9 months. I waited 3 weeks after surgery before I had the conversation. This was not strategic in the sense of planning the timing for effect. It was strategic in the sense that I had learned over 37 years that conversations with my parents that began while I was still in the acute phase of a feeling tended to produce less information and more performance, and that I needed the acute phase to pass before I could say what I actually meant, rather than what I was currently feeling, which were different things, and only one of them was useful. At 3 weeks, I was well enough to sit at a table without discomfort and to speak for more than 10 minutes without needing to rest, and I had a clear sense of what I wanted to say and what I was willing to receive in response. And I arranged for them to come to my apartment on a Saturday afternoon, and I made tea, and I sat down across from them at my kitchen table. I had 3 things I wanted to say, and I said them in the order I had decided before they arrived, which was factual first and emotional second and forward-looking third. Not because I was managing my emotions, but because the factual version of the events was the cleanest foundation for the emotional version. And the emotional version was necessary before the forward-looking one could be received. I said the first thing, which was factual. I said I had had emergency abdominal surgery on a Saturday morning in March. I said my parents had known about the surgery from Friday evening. I said they had arrived 7 hours after the surgery concluded and stayed 22 minutes. I said this without editorial, because the facts carried their own weight and did not require decoration. My mother said they had been at the shower. I said I knew. She said Becca had needed them there. I said I also needed them there, and that I had been in surgery for the first half of the morning and in a recovery room without family for the second half, and that both of those things were true, and that the choice they had made had determined which situation they addressed and which they did not. My father said they had come as soon as they could. I said they had come as soon as the shower ended, which was not the same as soon as they could, and that the distinction mattered to me and I needed them to acknowledge it rather than rephrase it. He was quiet for a moment. He said he understood. I said the second thing, which was emotional. I said I had been in situations of need throughout my life in which I had experienced them prioritizing other things over being present for me, and that the surgery was the most medically serious version of this, but not the only one. I said I was not delivering an exhaustive list. I said the ribbon from the science fair was in a box in my closet and had been there for 25 years, and I had not shown it to either of them, and I was not sure I would. My mother said she had not known I had won a ribbon at the science fair. I said I had told her when I called home. She said she did not remember. I said I knew, and that the not remembering was part of what I was describing. My father started to say something, and I said I was not finished. He waited. I said I was not telling them this so they would feel guilty. I was telling them because I needed them to understand the accumulation, meaning it was not about the shower or the surgery in isolation. It was about the pattern that had produced the shower and the surgery and the card addressed to the wrong name, and that the pattern had a name, which was insufficient attention, and that I needed them to know I had named it. I said the third thing, which was forward-looking. I said I was not withdrawing from the relationship. I said I was not issuing an ultimatum. I said I was telling them what I had observed and what I had named, and that what they did with that information was their decision, and not something I could control and not something I intended to monitor or enforce. I said I hoped that knowing the accumulation existed and had a name would be useful to them in how they showed up for me going forward. My mother said she was sorry. She said it twice, the first time in the reflexive way and the second time in the deliberate way, and the deliberate version was the one I received. My father said he thought he had not always understood what I needed and that he was going to try to do better. He said, "Try in the voice of someone who was not making a promise because the promise was not available yet, but who was committing to the effort, which is the most honest version of a repair commitment, and I accepted it as what it was." We sat at the table for another hour. We talked about things that were not the surgery and not the shower and not the card, the ordinary things. My work at the university. Their plans for the summer. The conversation was not warm in the way that conversations are warm after a resolution, because there had not been a resolution exactly. There had been a naming. And naming and resolving are different things that require different follow-up. The follow-up is still happening. It is 9 months in, and it is incremental, and it is real. I want to describe what the 9 months have contained, because change in families happens slowly and at the edges, and if you only look at the dramatic events, you miss the evidence. My mother called me the week after our conversation and asked about my recovery in terms that were more specific than she had previously used, meaning she asked about the incision and about the antibiotics and about whether I had been able to return to teaching, rather than asking how I was. Feeling in the general sense that does not require a specific answer. The specificity was the evidence. My father came to a lecture I gave at the university in May, which was a thing I had not asked him to do, and which he arranged his own after I mentioned the lecture at a family dinner in April. He sat in the third row. He asked one question during the Q&A, a genuine question about the research, rather than a performance of paternal engagement, and I answered it specifically, and we looked at each other across the lecture hall, briefly before I moved to the next question. And in that look was the beginning of something I do not yet have the full shape of. In June, my parents organized a dinner at their house, and they called it family dinner rather than Becca's dinner, which they had not previously thought to distinguish because the dinners had always been centered around Becca and her husband and their new baby, and my parents had not understood that they had been centering them until I named the accumulation. And the dinner in June had the specific and slightly effortful quality of a meal organized by people who are consciously trying to distribute attention differently and who are not yet natural at it. It was imperfect, and it was a departure from the previous arrangement, and I received it as what it was. Margot came over in July, 3 months after the surgery, and I told her about the conversation and the lecture and the June dinner. She listened, and then she asked if I thought it would last. I said I thought the intention was real, and that real intentions and lasting change were different things that required different amounts of time and different forms of maintenance, and that I was not going to maintain it for them, meaning the change was theirs to produce rather than mine to facilitate, and that I was going to keep my attention on my own life and observe what arrived from theirs rather than managing the gap between what I needed and what they provided. She said that sounded like therapy had been useful. I said I thought it had been. She said she was glad the surgery had not been worse. I said I was too. We sat in my apartment and we read our books, and she showed me something on her phone, and eventually I made dinner and we ate it, and she went home, the ordinary evening. The ordinary company of a person who knows how to be present, without requiring anything in return for the being present. I have been trying to learn that, both the receiving of it and the doing of it, for most of my adult life, and I am getting better. The card is in my desk drawer in the envelope addressed to Jacqueline. I kept it not as a grievance and not as documentation in the legal sense, but as a record of something specific that happened and that I do not want to misremember in either direction, meaning I do not want to make it worse in my memory than it was, and I do not want to make it better. It was what it was. A card with flowers. My mother's handwriting inside. The wrong name on the envelope. A surgery my parents chose to arrive at 7 hours late. A ribbon in a closet for 25 years. A pattern named after 37 years of accumulation. These are the facts. The facts are in my desk drawer, and they will stay there for as long as I find it useful to have them within reach. And when I no longer need them within reach, I will decide what to do with them. And that decision will also be mine. I am 37 years old. I am an assistant professor of environmental policy at a university in the city. I teach 2 courses per semester, and I supervise 3 doctoral students, and I am working on a book that I have been told by people whose judgment I trust is going to matter to the people in my field, and I am finding that I believe them, which is something I have had to learn to do, which is to receive an assessment of my work from a person who has no stake in managing how I feel about it, and to let the receiving be what it is. I had emergency surgery in March. My parents arrived at 4 in the afternoon and stayed 22 minutes. My friend Margot brought me crackers and a phone charger and sat with me for 3 hours and read her book. The card in my drawer is addressed to Jacqueline, and the flowers on the front are yellow, and the handwriting inside is my mother's. My name is Josephine. I have always been Josephine, and I will always be Josephine, and the next card will have my name on it. Because I said so plainly at my kitchen table 3 weeks after the surgery, and my mother said she understood and she was sorry. 2 things I have been waiting a long time for. Not the end of this story. The next chapter of it. I want to describe Margot more completely because she is in this story as the primary form of support I received during the surgery and recovery, and she deserves more than a supporting role. Margot is 39 and is a landscape architect who works at a firm in the city, and who I met 8 years ago at a city planning forum where she was presenting a project, and I was in the audience, and I asked a question after the presentation, and she said it was a good question, and we talked for 40 minutes in the lobby and went for dinner the same evening. She has the specific quality of someone who understands that being useful and being present are the same thing when the situation is serious and different things when it is not. And she has always known which situation she is in. On Friday evening, when I texted her from these emergency rooms, she replied within 4 minutes with 2 questions, which were, "Do you have your insurance card? And is there someone with you?" And the 2 questions contained everything she understood about what I needed in that moment, which was logistical confirmation and companionship in that order of immediate priority. She arranged the neighbor coverage. She brought the bag. She sat with me for 3 hours on Saturday evening, and she did not say anything that required me to respond to an emotion or manage her reaction to mine, which is the form of support that is most useful in the aftermath of a serious medical event, and the form that the fewest people know how to provide. When she left, she said, "I will check in tomorrow," and she did, a text at 10 in the morning that said, "How are you feeling?" and that waited for my specific reply before sending any additional message. She came back on Sunday afternoon, and we watched something on her laptop, and she brought food I did not have to ask for. I have been thinking about Margot's approach to care for the 9 months since the surgery. Not romantically, but analytically. Meaning I have been studying what she does and how she does it, and I have been trying to apply it in my own life with the people who are around me in need. And I think I am getting better at it. I also want to say something about Dr. Kwan, because she deserves more than 2 sentences. She came to see me on Sunday morning before my discharge, which is not always how it goes with a surgery that has concluded without complications, and she sat at the edge of my bed rather than standing, which is a posture that says I have a few minutes, rather than I am moving through the room. She asked how I was feeling, and she asked the specific kind of, "How are you feeling?" that invites a specific answer, rather than the general kind that invites fine. I told her I was feeling better than the previous evening, and she said that was consistent with the recovery trajectory for this type of procedure. And then she said something I have thought about since, which was that she had done emergency appendectomies for 17 years. And that the ones that went well were the ones where the patient had come in when something felt wrong rather than waiting, and that I had done the right thing, meaning I had come in when I needed to, rather than managing the denial, until the situation was past the point of clean resolution. She said it as a clinical observation and also as something she wanted me to hear specifically. I said I had almost not come in. She said she knew. She could tell from the way I had described my decision-making in the intake paperwork, and that the almost not coming in was the part she wanted to address directly, which was that the people who almost did not come in were often the people who had been trained by their circumstances to manage their needs independently and to minimize the imposition of those needs on the available system, and that this was a useful skill in some contexts and a dangerous one in others, and that a ruptured appendix was one of the others. I did not say anything for a moment. Then I said I understood what she was describing. She said she thought I did. She shook my hand, which is not something surgeons do at discharge as a standard practice, and she left. I have thought about that handshake and what it meant to extend it and what it meant to receive it. I want to describe the relationship with Becca because I have named her several times and I have not described what she is and what our relationship is and what role she played in the Saturday in March, and I want to be accurate about all three because accuracy requires including the complicated parts rather than only the legible ones. Becca is 32 and she is genuinely a good person and she loves her baby, whose name is Eli, and who is 5 months old now, and who has the specific completeness of a child who is completely present in each moment in the way that 5-month-olds are, meaning he is entirely there and entirely expressive, and he has not yet learned to manage his responses to things, and he makes clear exactly what he thinks of every situation he is in. I have held Eli twice. The first time was at the hospital when he was born, and the second time was at the June family dinner. Both times he looked at me with the evaluating look of someone who is deciding what category I fit in, and the second time he reached for my hair, which I took as a positive indicator. I like Eli. I do not hold Becca responsible for the shower or for the years before the shower. She did not create the pattern that produced the shower. She was placed at the center of a family dynamic by the same parents who placed me at its edge, and she has been inside that dynamic as long as I have been outside it. And what it has cost her is something I have thought about more than she knows, which is that being the center of insufficient parents' attention is not a good position even when it looks like the better one. She does not know about my 3-item conversation with my parents. I have not told her. What happens between me and my parents is between me and my parents, and Becca's relationship with them is hers. And I have no interest in reorganizing the family's emotional architecture by distributing information that was not shared with her, both because it is not my information to distribute, and because I understand that the family's arrangements and Becca's position in them are not something I want to disrupt in the name of my own repair. My repair is mine. Hers is hers. We have been, in the month since the surgery, in careful and slightly more frequent contact than we were before it, meaning she has called me 3 times since March when she had not called me for the preceding year, and each call has been specific rather than general, meaning she asked about the surgery and the recovery and my teaching and the book, and I received the calls for what they were, which was a small and specific movement in the direction of knowing each other better. Not enough to account for the Saturday. Enough to be real. I want to describe my work because I have named it and not explained it, and the explanation matters as the counterweight to the family story. I am an assistant professor of environmental policy, which means I study the structures through which societies make decisions about land use and resource allocation and climate adaptation. and I teach these structures to graduate students who are going on to work in government and nonprofit, organizations, and the private sector, and I supervise doctoral students who are producing the next generation of research in the field. The work requires two things simultaneously, which are the ability to hold a large and complex system in view, while also attending to the specific and granular details that determine whether the system is working as intended or failing, in ways that are not visible from the overview. I have been told by people who have watched me do this work for a decade that the combination of systemic and granular attention I bring to it is unusual, and that it produces analysis that is both precise and complete in a way that most researchers manage one of but not both. I know where this combination comes from, and it is not from my doctoral training, though the training refined it. It is from 37 years of living inside a family system and paying attention to the whole of it while also tracking every specific instance of how it operated, which is the kind of observation that becomes skill when it is applied to something other than the family that produced it, and which became skill in my case when I found the field that required exactly what I had already been doing without realizing it was expertise. The ribbon in the closet from the science fair is a data point in the history of a person who was always going to end up doing this kind of work. It just took the 25 years of accumulation to see it from the outside rather than from inside the closet. My doctoral advisor, whose name is Professor Wren and who retired in 2018 after 40 years in the field, sent me his message when I was in the hospital that said, "I heard you had surgery. I am thinking of you and get well when you can." I described this earlier, and I want to describe it more fully, because that message is a more complete model of how to communicate care than anything else I received during the surgery and recovery. It said she knew. It said she was thinking of me, which is the thing that is true about care, and which is the only thing that needs to be said. It said get well when you can, not get well soon, which is the standard phrase, and which has a quality of impatience in it, a slight pressure to recover on a timeline, whereas when you can places the timeline with me rather than with a social expectation. 3 sentences, no questions that required answers, no expressions of distress that I would have needed to manage, no instructions. Just the accurate and complete statement of care in exactly the form it could be received at that moment from a person who had known me for 12 years and who understood how I received things and had calibrated her message accordingly. I have been thinking about that calibration for 9 months, and I have been trying to apply it in my own communications with the people I care about. And I think about Professor Wren when I do it, and I think about the difference between care that is accurate and care that is performed, and I try to produce the former. The book I am working on is about adaptive governance in the context of accelerating environmental change, which is a subject that requires you to understand how systems adapt to conditions they were not designed for, and what the failures of adaptation look like before they become visible as failures, and how the people inside the system can identify the gap between the system's current state and the state required by the changed conditions. I did not choose this subject because it parallels the family story. I chose it because it is the most pressing question in my field and the one I am most equipped to address. But I have been aware, for the 3 years I have been working on the book, that the questions I am asking about governance systems are structurally identical to the questions I have been asking about my family for 37 years, which is how does a system that was built for a particular set of conditions fail when those conditions change? And what does the failure look like before it becomes catastrophic? And what is required for the system to adapt rather than to collapse? The science fair ribbon in the closet is the early failure indicator. The surgery and the card addressed to Jacqueline are the accumulation. The 3-item conversation at my kitchen table is the adaptation point. I am not sure the analogy holds all the way through. I am sure that the thinking I have been doing about governance systems has clarified the thinking I have been doing about my family, and that the clarification has been useful in both directions, and that this is what it looks like when a life is integrated, rather than compartmentalized, which is something I am working toward. My therapist, whose name I am not going to use because our work together is private, has been seeing me since I was 32 and told her about the science therapist, and has been the primary person who helped me develop the vocabulary for what I have been naming in this story. Not the events themselves, which I had always been able to describe accurately, but the structure underneath them, meaning the pattern, and what the pattern was called, and what it cost, and what naming it would require in terms of the conversations I would eventually need to have with my parents. I told her about the surgery in our first session after it happened, and she asked me what I had felt in the hospital in the hours before my parents arrived, and I said I had felt a specific kind of loneliness that was different from ordinary loneliness. And she asked what made it different, and I thought about it for a moment, and I said it was the loneliness of being in a situation that the people who were supposed to be there knew about and had decided something else was more important, and that the knowing about and the deciding something else were the parts that made it different from ordinary loneliness, which is the loneliness of being without something that was not available, whereas this was the loneliness of being without something that was available and had been withheld. She said that was a precise description. I said I was going to need to have a conversation with my parents. She said she thought so too. We spent 4 sessions over 2 months helping me understand what I was going to say and why I was going to say it now rather than at any previous point. And the answer I arrived at was that the surgery had been the situation I had been waiting for without knowing I was waiting for it. The situation clear enough and severe enough and specific enough that the conversation could no longer be postponed without the postponement itself, becoming a statement about what I was willing to accept. I had not been willing to accept that. I said so. She said she knew, that she had known since I told her about the ribbon, and that I had been getting here for 5 years and that I was ready. I believed her. I am still in session with her. The conversation at the kitchen table was the midpoint of the work, not the conclusion. There is a piece of information I want to add about the card which I have described and which I want to examine once more before I leave it. After I received the card, I called my mother and I asked her to confirm what she had written on the envelope. She said she had written my name and address. I said I had the envelope in front of me. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said it might be Jacqueline because she had written a card to her friend Jackie that week, and she might have mixed them up. I said her friend Jackie and I had different last names and different apartment numbers. She was quiet again. She said she was sorry, that it was a mistake. I said I believed it was a mistake, and that I also believed mistakes had information in them, and that the information in this mistake was that she had written my address but the wrong name, meaning the address was accessible to her and the name was not, which said something about the relationship between me as a location and me as a person in her working memory. She was quiet for longer than she was usually quiet. Then she said she had not thought of it that way. I said I knew. I said I thought she had not been thinking about me specifically when she wrote the card. She had been thinking about the gesture of sending a card, and that those two things were related but not identical, and that what I needed from her going forward was the specific version rather than the gesture version. She said she was going to try. I said I was glad. We said goodbye. I put the phone down and I sat with the conversation for a few minutes, and I thought about the difference between a location and a person and about which of those things I had been in my parents' lives, and I thought the answer was mostly the former for most of the time, and that what I had spent 3 weeks preparing to say and had now said was the beginning of asking to be the latter. I want to close by saying something about the lecture my father attended in May, because I described it and I want to go back to it. It was a public lecture organized by my department on the theme of infrastructure resilience, and I was presenting work from the early chapters of the book. And I had mentioned it at the April family dinner in the way that I mention professional events at family dinners now, which is specifically and without apology, meaning I said I was giving a lecture on Thursday the 15th at 7, and that it was open to the public, and that he was welcome to come if he was interested. He said he thought he might. He came. He sat in the third row. I did not see him until the Q&A because I was looking at my slides and at the room generally rather than at individual faces, and when I looked out during the question period and saw him, I felt something I want to describe accurately, which was not triumph and not vindication, but something quieter, which was the recognition of a specific effort being made in a specific direction, and of that effort being visible to me from the stage. He asked a question about the relationship between federal infrastructure funding and local adaptive capacity, which was a genuine question about the material and not a performance of paternal engagement, and I answered it specifically, and when I looked at him across the room while I was answering, there was something in his expression that I have thought about since, which was the expression of someone who is learning something they did not know, and who is finding the learning interesting, and that expression is available to my father. He has it in his professional life and in his engagement with history, and seeing it directed at something I had built rather than at something he had always already known was the kind of evidence I am going to hold on to in the coming years as the change continues to arrive in increments. It was not everything. It was real. If you have ever been in a situation where the people who loved you did not have your name right, not the literal name, but the name in the sense of who you actually are, tell me about it in the comments. Tell me what you did with the gap between who they thought you were and who you are. And if this story found you at a moment when you needed it, share it with someone who has been carrying an accumulation and has not yet found the words for it. Subscribe if you have not already, and check the link in the description. There is more there, and I think you will find what you are looking for.